Hello everybody. In this video I will be talking about fish stock assessment. And fish stock assessment is facing some serious challenges in times of low quality data and in times where the marine ecosystem becomes increasingly unpredictable, mainly driven by climate change. And we see fish stocks productivity suddenly change. We see natural mortality go in all directions. We see predators moving north and disappearing from the ecosystem, and new predators with different feeding patterns entering from the south, messing up the whole food web. So things change quickly, change profoundly, and become less and less predictable. Now, what if I would say that we have the solution to improve the quality of stock assessment? That this can be the basis of a new way of managing fisheries, to get rid of all the complexity of regulations and administration, significantly reducing the cost, and what I like especially, bringing fishers, scientists and managers together in an atmosphere of openness, cooperation and trust. All this is not just a concept or an idea, but already a reality in Belgium at TRL9. I would say keep on watching. So now first I want to make clear that I'm talking about demersal fisheries in the Northeast Atlantic. I'm not talking about pelagics, I'm not talking about other areas. And I want to start with an overview of the issues in the data that we use in stock assessment. The data which are the foundation of the stock assessment. Now, I'm not a stock assessor, I'm a gear technologist. So I'm interested in discussing all this and I'm interested in all your comments. So please post your comments. Now, if we want to carry out stock assessment, of course, we need data and they come in three pillars. The first one is the landings that we obtain through the logbooks. The second is the discard data that we obtain through sending observers at sea on board of fishing vessels. And the third one is the fisheries independent data. That's the data we get from scientific surveys on board of research vessels where we sample the young fish. So let's have a look at what goes wrong with each of those. Starting with the landings data. These are collected through the logbooks. So on board of the fishing vessel, the skipper fills out the logbook once in the 24 hours. To start with, that's a very low resolution, one data point in 24 hours. Now, but the size of the data set is determined by the size of the fleet, by the number of vessels. When I was young and started doing this job 35 years ago, the Belgian fleet had 250 vessels. Today there's 50 left, so that's a serious reduction of the data set. And that's something that we see in most of the member states in the EU. I think we can say in the Northeast Atlantic that the fleets have at least shrunk with 50%, and as such has the data set of the logbooks. Now, a second aspect of the landings data is the fishing pattern. Now, fishers used to be able to follow the fish. There was a seasonal fishery. And as a consequence, we would sample the high concentrations of fish. Now today, and if you look at this map, you will notice there's a lot of restrictions. Fishers cannot fish anymore where they want to fish. They cannot follow the high concentrations of fish. On top of that, you have the quota regulations and all kinds of measures that limit where fishers can fish. So the information we get from the data is different from the past. What consequences does this have for stock assessment? I don't know, but I'm sure it has. Now today we work with e-logbooks, everything is digitized. But still on board of the vessel, the skipper enters the data manually. And that brings errors. It's also open to fraud. So what does that do with the reliability of the data? Now in the past, when data were still filled out on paper, somebody in an office had to enter these data into the digital system. And that was a quality check. They knew the fishing vessels, and when something was wrong, well, they could just try and find out where it was wrong and they would correct it. Now today, this data just go in a big stream into the digital system, and in many cases, there's no quality check at all. And then it's up to the scientist, who is at quite a distance from the reality of fishing. It's up to the scientist to try and find out where the errors are and correct it, and that's just not possible anymore. So then we come at the second pillar of data, which are the discard data. And to obtain discard information, we send observers at sea. They sample the catch, they analyze the catch, and as such we know what is thrown overboard? Well, first of all, if you have an observer on board, you can ask yourself if the skipper will behave in the same way as there's no observer on board. So do we actually measure the actual discards? So that's a question. And then secondly, sending observers at sea is quite expensive. We would wish to send more observers at sea, but we don't, and as a consequence, we have a sampling percentage of something like, let's say, 1% in the EU, which is quite low, knowing that fisheries catches can be highly variable. So I think there's an issue with discards data as well. So then we have arrived at the third pillar of data collection. That's the fisheries independent data, the young fish surveys. So for that we send research vessels at sea who fish a whole grid of sampling stations. Now with the wind farms today and the marine protected areas and other restrictions, we cannot fish where we used to fish. So the sampling stations decrease. As such, the data set becomes smaller and the reliability of the whole information. Now a second problem is that for the beam troll surveys and other surveys, we use commercial fishing gears. For example, a 4 meter or an 8 meter beam troll, which is usually towed by a fishing vessel of 24 meters and a tonnage of 80 to 90 tons. Now many research vessels are much bigger. For example, the Belgian research vessel has a length of 70 meters and a tonnage of 3,800. So a fishing gear like that becomes a toy for a boat like that. Maybe no problem when the sea is flat, but as soon as we get waves, the fishing efficiency of a fishing gear like that, towed by a boat like that, becomes very different compared to nice weather. So the quality of the data and the variability of the data decreases. So again, for the third pillar, I think we have an issue with quality of data. So on top of all that, we have a number of other issues. And I think natural mortality is probably the most important one, a very critical parameter in stock assessment models. Now, in times with stable ecosystem, stable climate, we can keep natural mortality stable, and that's not really a problem. But in times of climate change, we see that natural mortality goes all directions, becomes completely unpredictable. And that can have serious consequences for the quality of stock assessment. Another issue is that we have a number of species with a full analytical assessment. But there's many data poor species. There's many species, commercial and non-commercial species, that we don't have any data. And then there's the food of the fish, let's say the benthic organisms, that we don't have any information about as well. So how can we ever implement the ecosystem approach with the data we have, especially with the lack of the data of the whole food web? How to deal with that? And then a big issue with stock assessment is the time lag between the moment we start collecting the data and the actual advice, and that's a period of 2 years. In times of climate change, where fish stocks change very quickly from one year to another, how does that affect the potential of managers to make measures, to take measures to actually overcome these quick changes? How to deal with all that? And maybe one of the issues that I have to deal with is the budgets. We see that the workload is increasing from year to year, and we see that the budgets are decreasing from year to year, and costs are increasing. So how do scientists have to deal with all these issues? I think we have some serious things to talk about. So besides all that, there's a number of issues that are more related to fisheries management. For example, the mesh size regulation. Everybody who has been at sea and knows the situation in the fishing fleets knows that where valuable fish escape a fishing gear, well, their fishers will fiddle around with the meshes and reduce the selectivity of the nets. So how to deal with that in stock assessment? If we assume a certain mesh size, but in reality, it's not that mesh size. It's probably much smaller. The second problem is engine powers. It is well known from a study in 2019 that within the EU, a lot of fishing vessels have engine powers in the hull that do not correspond with the engine powers on paper. A consequence is that catch per unit effort, which is an important parameter in stock assessment, is not reliable at all. The study says that something like 50% of the vessels have different engine powers in the hull compared to the paper. So that's an extra issue which complicates the whole stock assessment system. So, all this makes stock assessment less reliable. Now, what we are suggesting is not to replace the present system of stock assessment, but to add a real-time component to it. Now, what's quite easy that in Belgium we already have a data gathering system that works. The majority of the fleet is in what we call the VISTools system, which real-time collects the data from any instrument on board that produces data. So, for example, we are directly connected to the scale, which means no more human intervention. So we have reliable landings data. That's the first step. The second thing, we are working on cameras to analyze the discards. We'll not only have information on, let's say, the main target species, but also the data poor species, the non-commercial fish, and the non-commercial invertebrates, which gives us a lot of information on the functioning of the wider ecosystem. We do this for all holes, for all vessels, so we get a very wide coverage. And we can easily add other instruments. Like standard, we have the GPS, we have the fuel consumption, we have the towing force in the fishing line. We can add any relevant instrument to it. And good is that we do this in cooperation with the fishers. So on board, this makes it very easy and practical to make the system work, because fishers are our partners. So we have this proof of concept already fully operational in Belgium at TRL9. What we need now is cooperation with the international scientific community to develop models to deal with this high-resolution real-time data. We also need cooperation with fisheries managers to find ways to scale up this Belgian proof of concept and co-create a new way of managing fisheries. A new way that is simple in its regulations and administrations, that is simple and cheap in control and enforcement, that is producing reliable scientific data and allowing managers, fishers and scientists to cooperate in harmony. So, if you're interested, please challenge your colleagues, and of course feel free to contact me. If you're just curious and want to take a deeper dive, just have a look at this video. Thank you very much.